There are betrayals that arrive not with screams, but with the quiet slide of a forged signature. When my mother threw the canceled wedding notices on the table, she thought she was breaking me. She expected me to beg. She had no idea that envelope was not the end of my marriage. It was the starting gun for the execution of their $3 million fake empire. You think you know family cruelty? Watch me burn theirs to ashes. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now let's begin the story. My name is Chloe Bishop. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I drove my sedan up the winding, perfectly manicured driveway of my family estate in Denver. The property was a sprawling architectural marvel worth several $1 million, a fortress of glass and steel that looked down upon the city. I was carrying a thick leather-bound notebook pressed tightly against my chest. Inside that notebook were the blueprints of my happiness. It held months of meticulous wedding planning. There were fabric swatches, floral arrangements, tasting menus, and a guest list of over 200 people. I was stepping into my childhood home with the eager, foolish hope of a daughter wanting to share the final beautiful details of her upcoming marriage. The grand foyer echoed with the sharp click of my heels against the imported Italian marble. I found them in the West Wing sunroom, bathed in the golden afternoon light that made everything look expensive and untouchable. My mother, Eleanor, was seated gracefully on a velvet armchair. She was holding a crystal glass of red wine, her posture impossibly rigid, her expression entirely unreadable. Next to her, leaning casually against the mahogany mantelpiece, was my older brother, Julian. Julian was the golden boy, the arrogant chief executive officer of a tech startup that the family worshipped. He wore a bespoke suit that cost more than my car, staring at his phone with a look of perpetual boredom. I smiled, setting my heavy wedding binder down on the glass coffee table between them. I was out of breath, my heart fluttering with anticipation. I started talking about the string quartet, about how we finally secured the permits for the outdoor reception, about how perfect the weather was projected to be in 30 days. My mother did not look at the binder. She did not smile. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, set the glass down, and reached beside her. From a polished leather folder, she extracted a stack of crisp white papers and let them fall onto the glass table. They landed right on top of my seating charts. I looked down. They were invoices. The catering company, the event hall, the florist, the musicians. Across every single page, stamped in bold red ink, was the word "canceled." I blinked, the blood rushing in my ears, my mind struggling to process the visual data. I looked up at her, waiting for an explanation, waiting for the punchline of a cruel joke. Eleanor adjusted her diamond rings, her voice dropping the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. "We are not funding this circus." Julian finally looked up from his phone, letting out a short, mocking laugh. He walked over, picking up a sample of the silk ribbon I had carefully chosen before dropping it back down with absolute disgust. "Did you really think we were going to let you drag our reputation through the mud, Chloe? You are a bishop. Act like it. Cancel the whole thing and find someone in your own tax bracket. We are not throwing away good money on a pathetic little farmer who plays in the dirt for a living." They stared at me. They were waiting for the explosion. They wanted the dramatics. They expected me to scream, to cry, to drop to my knees and beg for their financial mercy. They thrived on that exact kind of power dynamic. They wanted to watch the silly, naive bride shatter into a million pieces on their beautiful marble floor. But as I stood there, looking at the two people who shared my blood, something entirely different happened. I did not cry. I did not scream. Instead, a profound glacial silence washed over me. I felt a distinct physical snap deep inside my chest. The desperate approval-seeking daughter I had been for 28 years simply ceased to exist in that instant. I looked at the canceled invoices. I looked at the contempt in my mother's eyes and the arrogant smirk on my brother's face. The sheer, unprovoked malice of their ambush was too perfect, too synchronized. I reached out slowly, gathering my binder. I tucked it under my arm, my movements steady and deliberate. I looked my mother directly in the eyes, gave a single curt nod, and said 2 words. "I understand." I turned on my heel and walked out of the sunroom. I did not slam the door. I did not look back. As I walked down the long, echoing hallway toward the exit, I knew exactly what they were thinking. They thought they had won. They thought I was running away to mourn my broken dreams in silence, thoroughly defeated by their superior authority. They were completely wrong. They forgot who they were dealing with. I am a senior data analyst. I spend 50 or 60 hours a week identifying systemic anomalies and running complex logistical algorithms. My brain is trained to spot the hidden variables. And right then my mind was racing through the data points of what had just occurred. Why did my mother insist on taking over the vendor contracts 3 months ago, claiming she wanted to be helpful? Why did Julian, who never cared about my personal life, bother showing up today, just to deliver a psychological blow? This was not just about snobbery. This was an orchestrated execution. The abrupt cancellation, the united front, the unnecessary cruelty, it was a smokescreen. There was a glaring loophole in their logic, a hidden motive they were trying to distract me from. By the time I started my car engine, I was no longer a heartbroken bride. I was a professional hunting for a vulnerability in a hostile system. Growing up a bishop meant learning how to perform for an audience before you even learned how to walk. In our house, unconditional love did not exist. Affection was a quarterly dividend paid out only if your optics were profitable for the family brand. Julian was the undeniable crown prince. He was groomed from birth to inherit the kingdom. He got the imported sports cars, the massive university donations to secure his admission, and the golden parachutes whenever he ruined a business venture. By the time he was 25, he had already crashed 2 tech startups, yet my parents rewarded him with a chief executive officer title and millions in seed money for a third. I was the exact opposite. I was practical, quiet, and fundamentally ordinary. In a family that worshipped ruthless ambition and glamorous aesthetics, being ordinary was considered a cardinal sin. I was useful only when they needed a diplomatic prop. I was the smiling, well-behaved daughter in a modest dress they paraded at charity galas to make themselves seem grounded and relatable to their investors. The rest of the year I was comfortably ignored, left in the shadows to crunch my data and live my quiet life. Then I met Liam. Liam was a structural and agricultural engineer. He spent his days with his boots deep in the soil working tirelessly to build a fully sustainable eco-farm just 45 miles outside the city limits. He smelled of fresh rain cedar wood and honest labor, not overpriced cologne and stale martinis. He did not care about aggressive stock portfolios or exclusive country club memberships. He was my sanctuary in a world of sharp edges. When Liam looked at me, he did not see a defective, boring bishop. He saw a brilliant analyst, an equal partner, and a woman worthy of absolute, unwavering devotion. To my family, however, Liam was an unacceptable stain on the pristine silk upholstery of our lineage. They openly mocked his faded denim jackets and the thick calluses on his hands. Julian called him a glorified dirt farmer whenever he thought I was not listening. But as I drove away from the estate, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, the reality of their hatred crystallized in my mind. They did not despise Liam simply because he lacked a trust fund or a recognizable last name. They despised him because he was dangerously, unapologetically authentic. He possessed a quiet, unshakable integrity that terrified people like my parents and brother. In the Bishop household, every relationship was a transaction, every conversation a negotiation, every smile a calculated lie. Liam's mere existence threatened their entire ecosystem of deceit. His honesty was a bright spotlight shining directly onto their rotting foundation, and they could not tolerate his presence in their sphere. But hatred and snobbery alone did not explain the sheer terrifying tactical precision of what had just happened in the sunroom. My mind began to untangle the web, analyzing the sequence of events over the past year. 6 months ago, my mother had suddenly insisted on taking over the vendor contracts. She claimed her accountant could handle the paperwork better, framing it as a generous gift to ease my bridal stress. I had been foolish enough to crave her approval and handed over the reins. It was never a peace offering. It was the opening move of a meticulously planned trap. She needed absolute control over the deposits, so she could pull the financial plug at the exact right moment, leaving me stranded and humiliated. Yet the math still did not add up. Why the united front? My mother, my father, and Julian were deeply selfish people. They rarely agreed on anything unless there was a massive tangible asset at stake. Their synchronized attack, their coordinated effort to ensure this wedding did not happen, meant this was not just a petty family squabble. Canceling my marriage was a desperate defensive maneuver. They were terrified of the legal implications of my union with Liam. If we got married, our finances would merge. We were planning to apply for a joint commercial mortgage to expand his farm next spring. That process would require a comprehensive, microscopic audit of my financial history. A cold chill crept up my spine. They were not trying to protect the family reputation from a humble farmer. They were trying to protect a secret. The question was no longer why they hated the man I loved. The question was what massive hidden liability they were so desperate to keep buried in the dark. The morning after the ambush, I refused to let my grief paralyze me. I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee and ran the numbers. Between my savings and my salary, I was short. But if I could secure a personal loan of $45,000, I could bypass my parents entirely, rehire the core vendors, and marry Liam on our exact chosen date. I was a senior data analyst with a pristine employment record and a six-figure income. A personal loan of that size should have been a standard frictionless transaction. I put on my sharpest blazer and drove to the downtown branch of my bank. The loan officer, a mild-mannered man in his 50s, took my application with a warm smile. He typed my social security number into his terminal. I sat across from him, already mentally drafting the emails I would send to the florist and the caterer. Then the rhythmic tapping of his keyboard stopped. The silence in the small glass office stretched into something heavy and suffocating. I watched his smile vanish, replaced by a look of profound confusion and then quiet pity. He turned the monitor slightly toward me. "Ms. Bishop," he started, his voice strained, "I cannot approve this loan. In fact, I am ethically obligated to ask if you are currently aware of the catastrophic state of your financial profile." I stared at him, my heart doing a slow, heavy roll in my chest. "Excuse me, I have zero debt. I pay my credit card in full every 30 days. My credit score is over 800. He shook his head and handed me a printed sheet of paper. "Your current score is 412. You have over a dozen accounts in severe delinquency, multiple accounts in collections, and a mountain of corporate liabilities that are currently 90 days past due." The air left my lungs. I snatched the paper from his hand. The words and numbers blurred together before snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. I did not say another word. I walked out of the bank, got into my car, and drove straight to my apartment like a woman possessed. I locked the door, booted up my dual monitors, and cracked my knuckles. For the next 6 hours, the heartbroken bride was dead. The forensic data analyst took the wheel. I paid for immediate unrestricted access to my complete credit histories from all 3 major bureaus. I pulled the raw data into a spreadsheet and began tracing the digital footprints of these phantom accounts. The web was incredibly dense, purposely obfuscated behind layers of holding companies and limited liability corporations. But numbers never lie, and they never hide if you know exactly how to query them. I followed the routing numbers, cross-referenced the registered business addresses, and finally unraveled the knot. Everything pointed back to a single parent company. It was Julian's tech firm. The dates on the initial credit inquiries hit me like a physical blow to the stomach. 5 years ago. It was exactly 5 years ago when my mother had tearfully asked for my social security number and a copy of my passport, claiming my father wanted to set up an emergency trust fund for me because of his failing health. It was a lie. A sick, manipulative lie. They had not set up a trust fund. They had used my pristine identity to forge my signature as the primary personal guarantor for a massive corporate credit line. The total principal amount was $3 million. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, the blue light of the monitors reflecting off my cold, dry eyes. $3 million of unsecured high-interest business loans had been keeping Julian's fraudulent empire afloat, and my name was strapped to the bottom of the ship like an anchor. Suddenly, the entire puzzle locked into place with a sickening click. The sudden cancellation of the wedding vendors, the vicious coordinated attack in the sunroom, their desperate need to keep me away from Liam. It had absolutely nothing to do with Liam wearing denim or working in the dirt. It had nothing to do with social class. Liam and I had been pre-approved to buy 50 acres of commercial farmland directly adjacent to his current property. We were going to apply for the commercial mortgage the second we returned from our honeymoon. The moment a federal underwriter looked at my financial background for a joint commercial mortgage, the $3 million bomb would have detonated. The identity theft would have been instantly flagged. The federal authorities would have been alerted. Julian, my mother, and my father would be facing decades in federal prison for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. They did not cancel my wedding out of spite. They canceled it out of sheer terror. They needed me legally single, isolated, and completely oblivious to my own financial ruin. The endgame became glaringly obvious. Julian's tech company was a hollow shell, and they were preparing to file for bankruptcy within the next 12 months. When the corporate veil collapsed, the furious creditors would bypass my wealthy family entirely and come directly for the personal guarantor on the dotted line, me. They were going to dump $3 million of toxic debt onto my shoulders, destroy my entire future, and walk away with their millions perfectly intact. They were preparing a financial slaughter, and they expected the naive, obedient daughter to walk right into the slaughterhouse. If I confronted them with the bank report, my parents and Julian would have offshore accounts set up and their assets liquidated within 48 hours. They had the limitless resources to disappear the money and leave me holding the massive bag of debt. I needed them completely relaxed. I needed them to believe they had decisively won. So I decided to play the most dangerous game of my life. I became the broken, defeated daughter they always wanted. I drove out to the farm and told Liam everything. It was the hardest conversation we ever had, but my partner did not flinch. He just held my hands and told me we were an unbreakable team. We formulated a plan. The next morning, I changed my relationship status online, deleted all our shared photos, and packed 2 large suitcases. When I arrived back at the marble foyer of the Bishop estate, I forced my eyes to well up with tears. I let my shoulders slump perfectly, mimicking the posture of a ruined woman. I walked into the drawing room where my mother was arranging imported lilies and collapsed onto the velvet sofa. I buried my face in my hands and sobbed. I told her the financial pressure of planning it alone was too much, that Liam and I had a massive fight about money, and that the wedding was completely off. I told her she was right all along. The performance was flawless. Eleanor dropped her expensive flowers, rushed over, and wrapped her arms around me. It was the warmest embrace she had given me in 20 years, and it made my skin crawl with revulsion. She stroked my hair, whispering that mothers always know best, that the family would always protect me from the harsh realities of the world. Julian walked in 10 minutes later. When he heard the manufactured news, he did not even try to hide his victorious smirk. He patted my shoulder and offered to pour me a very expensive drink. The little bird had flown right back into the golden cage exactly as they designed. I moved back into my childhood bedroom. For the first 7 days, I played the part of a grieving, heartbroken shell of a human being. I barely ate. I stayed in pajamas until noon. Then on the 8th day, I knocked on the door of Julian's home office. I told him I was going out of my mind with grief. I told him I needed a distraction, something mindless but time-consuming. I begged him for a temporary data entry or database management role at his tech firm. Julian leaned back in his leather chair, practically glowing with extreme arrogance. He thought it was a brilliant idea. Not only was he getting a senior data analyst from Aero Vanguard Logistics to clean up his messy back-end systems for pennies, but he could also keep me under constant, suffocating surveillance. He gave me a guest access badge and a desk in the basement server room, far away from the glamorous executive suites. He had no idea he had just handed the keys to the vault directly to a master locksmith. At Aero Vanguard Logistics, my daily job involved stress-testing military-grade encryption and tracking complex global supply chains. Julian's startup firewall was an absolute joke by comparison. It was built entirely for show, just like everything else in his life. For the first 2 weeks, I was the model corporate employee. I reorganized their customer databases and optimized their server loads during regular business hours. I smiled at the security guards. I drank bad coffee in the break room. But when the clock struck 7 in the evening and the office emptied out, the real work began. I told Julian I was working late to distract myself from painful thoughts of Liam. In reality, I was systematically dismantling his corporate security from the inside. At 11 o'clock at night, the only sound in the basement was the steady mechanical hum of the massive cooling fans. I bypassed the administrative blocks using a backdoor script I had written years ago. Once I was inside the private executive servers, I hit the absolute motherlode. The sheer volume of financial crimes documented on those network drives was staggering. I found the original digital scans of the bank documents with my perfectly forged signature. I found the hidden ledgers detailing how the $3 million had been illegally diverted to pay off Julian's personal gambling debts and my mother's luxury real estate purchases in Europe. But the most damning evidence of all was the internal email chains. There were dozens of messages between Julian Eleanor and my father, openly discussing the strict timeline of the impending bankruptcy. They literally referred to me as the ultimate scapegoat. I sat in the freezing server room reading an email where my mother casually calculated how many years it would take for my wages to be garnished by the furious creditors. My hands shook not from the cold air conditioning, but from a rage so pure and concentrated it felt like literal fire burning in my veins. I plugged a military-grade encrypted solid-state drive into the terminal. I began copying every single file. I took the wire transfer logs, the aggressive tax evasion schemes, the offshore account routing numbers, and the emails. The progress bar on the screen crawled. 10%, 20%. At exactly midnight, the heavy metal door at the end of the corridor clicked open. It was the night guard doing his hourly patrol rounds. My heart slammed violently against my ribs. The screen was glaringly bright, displaying file names like offshore transfers and guarantor forged signatures. If he walked into the server cage and looked at my monitor, the entire operation would burn to the ground immediately. I quickly hit a custom hotkey, snapping a blank, boring spreadsheet over the transfer window. I grabbed a thick manual on database structures and pretended to study it, my breathing shallow and incredibly fast. The guard's heavy boots echoed loudly on the concrete floor. He stopped right outside the glass wall of my section. He tapped the glass with his heavy flashlight. "Working late again, Ms. Bishop?" he asked, his voice slightly muffled. I forced a polite, deeply exhausted smile. "Just trying to fix a corrupted database table, Marcus. It is an absolute nightmare." He chuckled sympathetically. "Do not stay up too late. Have a good night." "You too," I said. I waited until his footsteps completely faded down the long hall before minimizing the spreadsheet. The transfer was at 85%. It felt like holding my breath deep underwater. Finally, a small digital chime signaled the completion. It took exactly 47 minutes to secure 500 gigabytes of raw, undeniable proof that my family was an organized crime syndicate. When the transfer reached 100%, I safely ejected the small drive, slipped it into the secret lining of my leather purse, and locked my computer. I walked past the night guard at 1 o'clock in the morning, giving him a tired, polite wave. Every single night after I drove back to the estate and locked the heavy door to my old bedroom, I would pull out a cheap burner phone I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out book. Under the thick covers in the pitch-black dark, I would text Liam. While I was actively infiltrating a corrupt financial empire, my supposed ex-fiancé was secretly coordinating with our most loyal friends. He was quietly relocating our entire wedding to a tiny, beautiful spot on his farm. He was building the wooden archway with his own 2 hands. We were orchestrating 2 entirely different productions in the absolute shadows. I was preparing a devastating funeral for the Bishop family legacy, and he was building the solid foundation for our real life. The trap was fully set. I just needed the perfect, very public stage to spring it. 3 weeks later, the trap was ready to be sprung. The stage was the Grand Imperial Hotel, the most exclusive and outrageously expensive venue in downtown Denver. Julian was hosting a massive black-tie fundraising gala. To the public eye, it was a glamorous event to announce a new Series C investment round for his tech company. In reality, it was a desperate, calculated cash grab. He was trying to secure another $10 million in liquid capital from a room full of arrogant, oblivious angel investors, so he and my parents could completely siphon the accounts and disappear before the federal bankruptcy hammer fell. My mother insisted I attend. She did not just invite me, she orchestrated my appearance. Eleanor marched into my bedroom holding a custom sapphire blue silk gown that cost more than a month of rent for most people. She aggressively smoothed the fabric over my shoulders, her diamond rings catching the harsh light of the vanity mirror. She told me to wear it to smile and to act like a woman who had finally come to her senses. She actually kissed my cheek and whispered that she was proud of my recent change of heart. I forced myself to smile back at her reflection, feeling absolutely nothing but ice in my veins. When we arrived at the grand ballroom, the sheer scale of their audacity was breathtaking. There were towering ice sculptures carved into the shape of the company logo. Waiters in crisp white tuxedos floated through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of imported champagne. Over 300 members of the financial elite were packed into the room, their voices merging into a deafening, arrogant roar of wealth and privilege. Eleanor immediately grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging painfully into my skin like sharp little claws. She dragged me from one wealthy partner to another, parading me around like a newly rehabilitated show pony. I shook hands with hedge fund managers and real estate tycoons. I let them offer their fake sympathies for my canceled wedding, and I delivered my rehearsed lines flawlessly. I told them I realized I had almost made a terrible mistake. I told them my family knew what was best for my future. Eleanor beamed with terrifying pride, bragging loudly to anyone who would listen about how the prodigal daughter had finally returned to her senses. Across the room, Julian was holding court. He looked like the absolute king of the world, wearing a velvet dinner jacket, laughing loudly and slapping the shoulders of men who were about to write him massive fraudulent checks. He was entirely consumed by his own brilliant reflection. Neither of them had any idea that 3 hours prior to the gala, I had paid a quiet, highly technical visit to the hotel audio-visual control room. I had volunteered to coordinate Julian's massive slide deck presentation, a task he gladly handed off to his obedient sister. I had plugged a secondary flash drive directly into the master projection terminal programmed with a very specific automated delay. At exactly 8 o'clock in the evening, the heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed. A solitary, bright white spotlight snapped onto the main stage. Julian walked up to the acrylic podium, holding a glass of champagne soaking in the thunderous applause of the room. He tapped the microphone. He launched into a charismatic, deeply rehearsed monologue about innovation, about the future of technology, and about the unparalleled integrity of our family name. Behind him, a massive 30-foot projector screen descended from the ceiling, ready to display his fabricated revenue projections. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julian boomed into the microphone, flashing his million-dollar smile. "Tonight, I am not just asking you to invest in a company. I am asking you to invest in a legacy of absolute transparency and unprecedented growth. Look at the numbers. He pressed the remote clicker in his hand. The screen flashed brilliantly white, but it did not show a line graph pointing toward the sky. Instead, the projector displayed a high-definition massive scan of the original commercial loan application from 5 years ago. My name was at the bottom, but the signature was blatantly sloppily forged. Julian frowned aggressively, clicking the remote again, assuming it was a simple technical glitch. The slide advanced, but not to his pitch deck. The next slide was an internal email chain between him and our mother. The text was blown up to massive proportions, highlighting a specific sentence from Eleanor in bright yellow marker. It read, "We can keep the debt fully concealed in her name for at least another 12 months before the creditors freeze her personal assets. She will never know until the bankruptcy goes public." A strange, suffocating silence swept across the ballroom. 300 guests stopped drinking. The string quartet abruptly stopped playing. The only sound was the frantic, panicked clicking of Julian's remote as he desperately tried to shut the system down. But my override script had locked the terminal entirely. The slides continued to advance automatically every 10 seconds. Next came the offshore routing numbers. Then came the itemized receipts showing exactly how the corporate funds were illegally diverted to pay for luxury yachts and overseas real estate. The entire anatomy of their $3 million federal wire fraud was bare for the entire city to see. Julian stood frozen at the podium, all the blood draining from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Then came the flashing lights. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of the ballroom, a chaotic storm of red and blue suddenly illuminated the Denver night sky. The wailing sound of heavy sirens grew deafening. A fleet of black tactical vehicles had violently swerved onto the hotel promenade, completely blocking all the exits. Before the security guards could even react, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. Dozens of federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests swarmed into the opulent room. They moved with terrifying calculated precision. "Nobody move hands where we can see them," a senior agent shouted, his voice echoing off the marble walls. The crowd of elite billionaires erupted into a frenzy of panicked screaming and frantic shoving, their elegant composure shattering instantly. The agents bypassed the terrified guests and marched directly onto the stage. They grabbed Julian by his velvet shoulders, slamming him aggressively against the acrylic podium. The sharp metallic click of heavy handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the room, microphone amplifying the sound for everyone to hear. Across the chaotic floor, 2 other agents had cornered Eleanor and my father near the towering ice sculpture. My mother was shrieking, her sapphire gown catching on the edge of a catering table as an agent forced her hands behind her back. The aristocratic, untouchable facade of the family was completely pulverized in a matter of seconds. As the cold metal locked around her wrists, Eleanor frantically scanned the frantic room. Her wild, panicked eyes finally locked onto mine. I was standing perfectly still at the edge of the crowd, holding a single glass of untouched champagne. I did not look away. I did not flinch. I offered her a slow, extremely deliberate tilt of my champagne flute. In that singular, devastating second, all the puzzle pieces clicked together behind her horrified eyes. She stopped screaming. The color vanished from her skin. She finally realized who had written the computer code, who had leaked the private emails, and exactly who had directed this magnificent, catastrophic circus. 4 days after the catastrophic events at the gala, I walked into the sterile, fluorescent-lit visitor room of the Federal Detention Center. I sat down on a cold metal stool and picked up the heavy black telephone receiver. On the other side of the thick, bulletproof glass sat Eleanor. She had been entirely stripped of her silk gowns and diamond rings, now wearing a shapeless, faded orange jumpsuit. Her perfectly styled hair was undone, and her face was pale, exhausted, and devoid of any aristocratic arrogance. When she saw me, she immediately burst into loud, theatrical tears. She pressed her trembling hand against the glass partition. Through the receiver, she launched into a desperate, weeping monologue about the sacred bond of motherhood. She cried about how families make mistakes how her health was failing, and how I needed to show mercy and withdraw my federal witness statement so we could reach a compromise. She begged me to save her. I sat perfectly still, letting her tears run their full course. I looked at the woman who had birthed me, expecting to feel a twinge of guilt or sorrow. Instead, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity, no anger, just a quiet, endless expanse of profound liberation. When she finally paused to catch her breath, waiting for me to comfort her, I leaned forward. I looked directly into her panicked, cold eyes. "I told you," I said, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. "I said I understood. You canceled my wedding, and I canceled your entire future." I did not wait for her response. I placed the receiver back onto the hook with a solid, definitive click. I stood up, turned my back to the glass, and walked out of the prison. I did not look over my shoulder, completely ignoring the muffled, frantic screams echoing behind me. The aftermath was swift and absolute. The federal authorities conducted a massive forensic audit, officially clearing my name of the $3 million in fraudulent corporate debt. My credit score was fully restored. As for the Bishop family, the government seized absolutely everything to compensate the furious investors. The $1 million estate in Denver was auctioned off. The luxury cars were impounded. Their hidden offshore accounts were frozen and drained dry. They were left completely penniless, facing decades in federal prison with nothing but the clothes on their backs. With the suffocating shadow of my family finally lifted, I returned to Aero Vanguard Logistics. I was quickly promoted to a senior directorship role, finally allowed to use my analytical talents freely and entirely for my own growth. I was no longer a pawn in someone else's fraudulent game. 30 days later, Liam and I finally had our wedding. There were no towering ice sculptures, no imported crystal flutes, and absolutely no members of the financial elite. We stood barefoot on the soft green grass of his eco-farm. The sky above us was painted in brilliant shades of orange and purple as the sun slowly set over the fields. We exchanged our vows under a simple rustic wooden archway that Liam had built with his own 2 hands. We celebrated with a small handful of our closest friends, eating good food and laughing under the open sky. As the evening cooled, I stood by the fire pit, smiling softly as I leaned my head against my husband's strong shoulder. I watched the warm flames dance in the dark, feeling a deep, unshakable peace settling into my bones. I realized then that the most perfect revenge is not simply watching your enemies weep. The ultimate victory is standing on the ashes of their ruined empire, using that fertile ground to plant a beautiful, quiet happiness that absolutely no one can ever take away from you. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it. As an ad-free channel, your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Haley Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we'd love to connect with you. Please leave a comment telling us which city or state you're listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.